welcome back to History in a Nutshell. Now, we've touched previously in our videos on topics relating to the Enlightenment, to the scientific revolutions, and to the long shadow they've cast over human experience. And a word that you can't really avoid in discussing that, and a word that you can't really avoid discussing history more broadly, is this concept of liberalism. Now, liberalism is a very, very broad ideology, and there's a lot to it. And there's a lot that fits under the definition of liberalism. Many movements have described themselves as liberal in different senses of the word. The word liberal is used very loosely. But what I'm going to propose to you today is that far from being this sort of slightly boring ideology that's neither socialism or conservatism and is, into human reason and freedom, but is a bit wishy-washy and mushy and indecipherable, as liberalism is often seen by students of history and students of political theory, I'm going to propose to you that liberalism actually has a far more spicy history, and actually there's some interesting characters in the liberal family tree. And I think popular culture, popular etymology, and how we think about political history and how we think about political ideologies often gives liberalism a bad name and doesn't really obscure the wonderful nuances that are wrapped up in this word. So I suppose we should begin with the sort of etymology, really. What is a liberal? What is liberalism? Now, the sort of conventional definition is that, well, liberals like individual freedom. Related definitions, liberals have a rational view of humanity and want to promote rationalism, or some variant thereof. Other variants, other people will say, well, liberalism describes a number of ideologies that emerged from the late 18th century around different concepts of freedom. And often, this is going to be a bit of a bugaboo of mine, we'll turn to later, but often when defining liberalism, there's this notion of the separation of sort of classical liberalism and social liberalism. And I'm going to touch later on, actually, why I think that's a false dichotomy and why I think it needs to be reassessed, if you will. So, what actually is liberalism? Well, yeah, you can define it as liberals like human freedom. But is that all? Is there more nuance to that? Well, for a start, doesn't everyone really like human freedom? Doesn't everyone living in the modern world really quite like a lot of liberal principles? Freedom of expression, secularism of society, so forth and so on. So, how do we define it? And I think, to cut a very long story short, there's a sort of checklist of things that a liberal movement needs, and all the liberal movements discussed in this video more or less agree on. An emphasis on the freedom of the individual, obviously. A firm secularism. Now, that's not to say that some of the historical characters we'll discuss here didn't hold religious views in their personal lives, but I think liberalism is its tradition. Liberalism, by any working definition, is an avowedly secular, irreligious, often anti-clerical movement. Tied in with that, there's a certain emphasis on human reason and how human reason can be harnessed, and a scepticism towards tradition, traditional hierarchies, and pre-modern ways of thinking, if you will. So, I think one thing that liberals are often associated quite rightly with is this idea of free trade, and it is difficult to think of a liberal movement that wasn't into free trade. Of course, here in Britain, the obvious case study of this is the Anti-Corn Law League, which was formed in 1839, and is a tremendously important, though often overlooked, organisation in British political history, because it is genuinely the first mass popular movement. Remember, we're still in a pre-democratic era in British history at this point, long before universal suffrage. But what we have here is the prototype of a mass organisation, a pressure group, a mass movement of ordinary men and women on the street being mobilised for a set goal. The repeal of the Corn Laws, the tariffs on grains, that protected the interests of wealthy landowners and forced prices up for everyone else. So in essence, if you wanted to import grain, you had to pay a very high tariff. So therefore, domestic grain growers and domestic land growers could charge a much higher price, which pushed the price of all of the commodities based on those items up. So the Anti-Corn Law League, founded in 1839 by Richard Cobden, is ultimately successful in nullifying the Corn Laws and sort of forms a consensus around free trade in British national life that in many ways actually becomes a characteristic of British foreign policy. Whilst I don't think Richard Cobden would have liked this, one of the defences you sometimes hear about the British Empire is that, it promoted free trade, it wasn't that bad, it promoted free trade. So, we have this very interesting figure of Richard Cobden, the sort of classical liberal, the sort of pre-welfare state liberal, who's into, economic freedom and political freedom, and he wants to get the government out of people's lives and allow them to sort of engage in commerce and to buy and sell without hindrance by the state. Now, Cobden, as he's sometimes mentioned in popular culture, is seen as almost a sort of conservative figure who's on the side of sort of big business and big industry that wants free trade. And he's often seen as synonymous with this very vague concept of classical liberalism, which is perceived to be the more right-wing form of liberalism. But was Richard Cobden really a man of the right in any way? And when you examine his life, depending on what you would define as right-wing, it soon becomes apparent that Cobden was a pretty radical man, really, and he should be remembered as such. So, we mentioned previously, Richard Cobden is probably most famous for his leadership of the Anti-Corn Law League, the first successful pressure group, so on and so forth. But he did so much more than that, and free trade was only one cornerstone of the sort of pyramid of beliefs he had. Richard Cobden was perhaps the most consistently anti-war figure in British life during his time. In fact, he is a cornerstone of the 19th century peace movement. He is really an international figure of global significance in the peace movements of the 19th century. Now, the various peace movements that sort of emerged in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars were centred on the sort of peace congresses. These idea of gathering delegates from various nationalities to sort of avoid a sort of pan-European or pan-global war on the style of the Napoleonic Wars. And Cobden is a big figure of that. In fact, he's attendant at all of them from 1848 to 1853. So he's travelling to these congresses on his own expense to try and de-escalate conflict. So he's very, very anti-war, he's very non-interventionist, he's very anti-militarist. After Napoleon III comes to power in France, he consistently opposes efforts to sort of ramp up military tensions with France. He joins Lord Palmerston's cabinet to negotiate the Cobden-Chevalier Pact, the sort of free trade and mutual security agreement between the Second French Empire and Great Britain. He is opposed to the Crimean War, and we'll be doing a video on that shortly because that is very, very relevant to today's geopolitics, if you will. But Cobden is not some sort of whining liberal or some sort of little petit bourgeois mail-reading right-winger that you might think he is. He's a really interesting guy, and he's actually really quite a radical guy. And, if you look further afield, you actually discover there is quite a deep-rooted tradition of liberal anti-militarism. Obviously, if you look at sort of German-speaking Europe, which is a very interesting case study in liberalism, you can see that not only does liberalism not fall into the sort of neat categories that many people think it does do as an ideology, but it goes into some quite interesting corners. So, again, if you look at someone like Wilhelm von Humboldt and the Prussian reformers, including people like von Clausewitz, the famous military writer who some of you might be familiar with, they're often described as classical liberals. And again, it just shows how that dichotomy between sort of social liberals and classical liberals is in some way flawed. Wilhelm von Humboldt and his Prussian mates are working for an absolutist monarch. So, whilst they're liberals and can be described as liberals, I would argue, in that they challenge social custom, Wilhelm von Humboldt, reforms the Prussian school system, von Clausewitz is instrumental in reform of the army. The dichotomy between sort of social liberals loving the state, classical liberals hating it, it's a very awkward, false Manichean dichotomy we've got ourselves into. I don't think it's that clear cut. But, I think German liberals are sort of overshadowed for obvious reasons in the country's history. And they're often seen as the losers of German political history. You'll get people who research German Marxists, the Spartakists, you'll get people who research the German Social Democrats, but there seems to be very little academic appetite at the moment for German liberalism. And I don't know why this is, quite frankly, because this is a fascinating topic, and it's not always what you would think. So, German liberals seem to have a bit of a reputation as being these sort of vaguely cuckolded, pathetic centrists who do nothing, and they just sort of tag along with whatever's going up. But, actually, German liberals have an interesting history of doing some quite radical things. So, the German labour movement, if you want to think of it, in some ways is wrapped up with the history of German liberalism. Friedrich Wilhelm Raiffeisen founds the first credit unions, and to this day, the word Raiffeisen in German is synonymous with agricultural cooperatives. Because he founded what you might call credit unions to give credit to different farmers and to agricultural producers, so they weren't subordinate to moneylenders. And the various spin-offs of this and the various institutions that grew out of this, the Raiffeisen, are still around, really. They're still a thing. Victor Huber, in the early 19th century, forms the first housing cooperatives, and is instrumental in getting cooperative housing schemes for workers off the ground. And again, if you look across the 19th and early 20th century Germany, the left liberals are quite far left in some ways, you could say. So if you look at the German People's Party, for example, in the Weimar era, they're not this sort of pathetic little party that many people make them out to be. They're quite significant. They're part of the original Weimar coalition from 1920 to around 24, with the Centre Party, with the Social Democrats. They've got some quite significant members. Ludwig Quidel, who wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's an anti-militarist. He's against militarism. And I think you'll notice a reoccurring theme emerging here is that when you get very committed liberals, people who are very committed to liberalism, to individuality, to minimalise state intervention, they're often very, very consistently anti-militarist, and this is a reoccurring theme that will crop up in their life's work and in their politics. And, he was a key figure of the German Peace Society. He wanted peace with the Soviet Union. He wanted peace with France. Remember, France at this point in history is Germany's traditional rival. And you've had, if you think back to it, reunified Germany from following after Bismarck and the Franco-Prussian War, and the French Republic or Empire scrabbling for hegemony on the European continent, scrabbling for military hegemony, scrabbling for industrial hegemony and competing scientifically. So, he's a very consistently anti-militarist man. He wants to go and make peace with the traditional enemy of Germany. Remember, France occupies the German Ruhr. in 1924. So he's really doing some quite provocative things. His mate, Paul von Schonach, is a very interesting figure. He's actually a German army officer. He's an officer in the Reichswehr, the army of the Weimar Republic. But he's a member of the League of Friends of the Soviet Union. And he's interested in land reform. He's interested in making peace with the close European neighbours, but also favouring a bilateral relationship with the young Soviet Union. Whilst paradoxically being an army officer, he's consistently arguing for what you might call collective security, for brokering peace with different competing nation states and forming, areas in which mutual interest can arise. So he's a really interesting guy, and I think what we can take away from this brief case study, and there'll probably be a follow-up episode where we look more specifically at some of these movements and what we can learn from them, is that liberalism is a very, very influential ideology in human history. That goes without a doubt. Liberals consistently want free trade and typically are quite keen on free enterprise and what you might call free market economics. But liberals aren't sort of pathetic, middle-class, closeted Tories, as they're sometimes seen necessarily in the public imagination. If you look at Richard Cobden, if you look at the early liberals around the Cornwall League, the Corn Law League, they were very much into peace. They were very much into sort of proto-European integration, if you will. They were very much into mass mobilisations. They were very anti-militarist. If you look at the German counterparts, if you look at German liberalism, what you often find is people who are consistently anti-militarist. So I think there is a liberal component to foreign policy thinking that needs to be further examined by academia and needs to be better historicised, and I think there's a gap in the scholarship here. And also, we're seeing this notion that this sort of dichotomy between classical liberalism, or sort of right-wing liberalism, and sort of left liberalism or social liberalism isn't really that clear-cut. There's people who you might describe as classical liberals who work for an absolutist state. There's people who you might describe as classical liberals, but they're actually quite radical. They're not really that conservative. So we'll probably do a follow-up video on this because I think this is such a deep topic. But in short, liberalism is a bit spicier, a bit more multipolar, and a bit meatier and more exciting an ideology than many people have previously assumed. Thank you for watching.